to Mental Health Momentum, a Silicon Slopes podcast. I'm Dr. David Morgan. I'm a licensed psychologist and the Director of Mental Health Awareness here at Silicon Slopes. On this podcast, we talk about the impact of mental health on businesses, individuals, and communities, and have discussions to find solutions for those. And today I would like to introduce my guest on the podcast, Tom Telford. Tom, welcome.
Thank you for having me. This is great.
I'm so glad that you're here. I'm going to read your bio here. Tom Telford is the owner and chief strategy officer of LÉVO, like Lego, but with a V.
Yep, you got it.
A mind care company that employs mental health clinicians serving Utah communities along the Wasatch Front. Tom spent more than 20 years in institutional financial services with expertise in institutional asset management and executive compensation plans. In 2015, Tom and two partners sold their firm, BFB, to Arthur J. Gallagher. Tom is also the co-host of Brainstoke Podcast, and along with his wife, Liza Telford, who's a licensed marriage and family therapist, they operate Telford Holdings, LLC, which is an investment holding company, has assets in mental health care, media, multi-unit housing, commercial real estate, and intellectual property. Tom is the father of 3 children and enjoys pedaling all types of bikes, skiing in the backcountry, and sitting in the sun. He has a master's degree in organizational leadership from Gonzaga University. Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Of course. Thank you for having me. This is great.
Gonzaga, which is in Spokane.
It is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which we were just talking before the podcast that I'm a transplant from Washington State. So
yeah,
I've worked in Spokane, gone out there to do
beautiful part of the
contract.
country.
It is. And it's so different from Western Washington.
Mm-hmm.
You get out there and there's just, it's still green, but not quite as green. But I loved going out, loved the time I spent in
Love
Spokane.
the trees. Yeah, when I chose Gonzaga, I had no idea what a Jesuit university is. So I had a new education growing up in Utah. But yeah, just love the people of Spokane, and yeah, great experience.
And I learned that Spokane and Spokane Valley are not the same thing.
No.
Those are two separate cities. Yeah.
That's right.
Exactly.
That's right.
I think, that's going to be the same. That's just Little Valley. No, those are two separate things. Something you learn when you spend a little bit of time in Spokane.
Absolutely.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe more than what I read in the bio, just how you got to this point. It sounds like your holdings are somewhat diversified. And so now getting into mental health, kind of what got you there?
Yeah. What a long journey, to be in mental health. So by background, I'm trained and educated in investing other people's money. And so when I was, a college student, I actually started in financial services with a firm called Northwestern Mutual. And so I was going to school full time. I was working full time at Northwestern Mutual, and I was married young. I got married at 21 and started a financial services career. And at the time, I thought I was going to do personal financial planning for most of my career. I loved communicating with people, loved sitting with people. And so I started there, and as I got myself through school, finished a bachelor's at Weber State University in professional sales, what I started to recognize is that in financial services, the success that you have is directly correlated to the people that you work with and those people and their investable assets. And so to invest and to manage more money really is the name of the game. You either have or create more clients, or your assets per client need to be greater.
Right.
And so as time went on, there was something that I mastered pretty young in my career. When you're not bright, in terms of your knowledge and, capability in terms of learning. I was a slow learner growing up, struggled in school, had a hard time paying attention.
You didn't tell us the people you're managing their money, right?
Surprise.
Right.
Yeah. In those early years in my early 20s, what I started to recognize building my own, client base and building relationships with clients is that trust is key, having that trusted relationship with people and the ability to communicate and connect on a deep level. And so even though I struggled in school growing up, when you struggle learning, this is part of my mental health story, so it ties in here. But when you struggle in school and you're the kid who's called out of class by tutors and you're kind of deemed the slow kid, what you start to build is the capabilities to survive, right? And you know this from a psychologist perspective. you play the cards that you're dealt with.
Yeah.
And when you can't learn by listening, or you can't learn in books, what you really start to gain is an understanding of how you deal with people, the expectations they have for you, how they communicate with you. You learn nonverbal really young because you have to learn to survive in an environment where there's expectations for you to sit in a desk and be quiet and to pay attention and to stay on task. And so all of these skills and capabilities that kids who can't pay attention are built at a young age, and they become the secret sauce, right, for certain careers. Hence why some people say ADHD actually is a secret power, and it's a power for the ability to have skills and abilities that you otherwise wouldn't have unless you had to rely on and build those capabilities. Well, in my early 20s as a financial advisor, I learned how to invest people's money. I learned all of the science and the math behind, what it takes to invest people's money. But finance is actually, it takes a back step or a back seat to the ability to connect and communicate with people. And I had learned those things at a young age, even though I never would have said in my, youth or in my teen years that I would be a financial advisor. I became pretty competent at connecting with people. Even when I was in my 20s, I had clients who were in their 40s and 50s and even older, because I would just tell the truth. I learned quickly and early on in my childhood that if you could just communicate clearly and tell the truth, that you would gain trust with people pretty quickly. So even in my 20s, I was building clients in financial services, and I could connect with people pretty well and gain trust with people. Although I learned those skills growing up, I have to admit, serving an LDS mission absolutely accelerated my ability to connect with people on a deeper level. Selling God door to door is that's a whole new level of sales. Yeah, I learned those things building, clients, in financial services in my 20s. But as I said earlier, to be a financial advisor, you really have to add more clients or add more assets per client. And so as silly as this sounds, this is my simplified brain, sitting thinking, as an entrepreneur, how do I work with more assets? How do I build more assets under management, it's called. And I just landed on, the organizations who have the most money are banks and credit unions. And so at a very early, stage in my career, about 5-6 years in, I ended up starting to learn what's called institutional financial services, or investing institutional money. And part of, the capabilities that I learned when you're, again, at a young age, you try to survive. Instead of learning out of books or learning from teachers, you start asking lots of questions. I'm sure I drove my parents nuts asking a billion questions. But in my 20s, one of the things that I mastered was seeking out and attracting really good mentors. And so in my 20s, I had several great mentors, including 2 gentlemen who knew institutional financial services well. I met them in Newport Beach. My wife and I moved to Newport Beach and Aliso Viejo, actually in Orange County, for about 1.5 years. And during that time, I met a couple gentlemen who were doing this at a high level. And because of who I am, and if you're reliant upon yourself to survive financially, commission driven, then you talk to everybody. That's just what you do. Well, I reached out to these gentlemen, and I ended up seeking out their mentorship and learning what institutional financial services was. And pretty quickly, they gained an interest in me just because I was willing to call anyone. I was willing to cold call in everybody. And so they talked to me for a few months, kind of learning, how that industry works. And then out of the blue, I called one of them who was in Princeton, New Jersey, and just said, "Hey, I got a bunch of appointments with banks. I need you to come to Utah." And he just sat there and he's like, "You did what?" Like, you didn't even check my schedule. But anyway, long story short, I ended up having him come out. We spent, a few days traveling together. That relationship grew and grew. And I ended up morphing my business or my professional life from individual personal planning to institutional financial services. And that really kind of blew up my career. It took off at that point where instead of sitting with individual people and talking finance, it really was sitting in front of large boards of directors of institutions and learning what it's like to try to get 15 to 21 strong personalities, leaders in the community, to all get on one page and vote to hire our firm. And that was a rush. And that was kind of a turning point about 27, 28 years old for me of doing financial services instead of a individual level at a high institutional level. So that's the beginnings.
So LÉVO specializes in connecting people with mental health services.
It does.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's a virtual model. Is that right?
It's not actually. Yeah. I mean, we've tried to build a brick and mortar practice to a degree where when people come to LÉVO seeking mental health services, LÉVO does not do psychotherapy.
Okay.
We do not employ therapists, but there's a component of those who we employ who what we call them providers. They are men and women who are trained to assess, diagnose, and treat ongoing mental health, all sorts of diagnosis. But most of the time, we are assessing and diagnosing for the capability of will medication help this individual. Yeah, and so LÉVO is really working in collaboration with lots of other, mental health and other healthcare professionals. So the majority of LÉVO clients come to us that are referred by their therapist, right, or a counselor or a social worker or a pediatrician or an OBGYN who's saying, hey, you really should go speak with LÉVO, who happen to be mental health specific trained in mental health medication management.
Right.
So,
which is, there's a huge need for that. I mean, people come to me all the time and they say, they'll say, I need to get on medication, or I'd like to get on medication and I need to find a psychiatrist. And I say, good luck.
Yeah.
I mean, if you can find one, it's not that they're not out
lists.
there, but the waiting lists are insane.
Right.
Or especially now, I mean, there's such huge demand for mental health services since COVID, and the supply has way outstripped, or the demand has way outstripped the supply, I should say. And so there's there were waiting lists pre-COVID for psychiatrists, and now if you can find one that even has a waiting list that hasn't just closed her practice or said, I'm not taking any new patients,
right,
it's really hard. And then you have on the other side, and I think it's wonderful that we have general practice people out there who are trying to do the best they can, but these are not the people that you want to get your mental health medications from in most cases. I don't know. Like I said, I don't mean to throw any shade on anyone that way, but it's great to have specialization, especially in this area, because these are things, particularly when you're getting beyond some of the more mundane mental health issues. You need someone who really understands the specifics of psychiatric medication. And so this is great. It's kind of, I think, filling a need that is definitely there.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because, as an investor, my prior life was doing heavy due diligence for institutions to invest their money. They wanted to know that someone was going to do the heavy lifting and the legwork and the due diligence to decide where to put their money. When we chose to start LÉVO as a mental health medication management, one of the things that we did is sit with other healthcare providers. In fact, there were other healthcare providers who were saying, you guys should start this company because our waiting rooms for doing sports physicals, our waiting rooms for providing whatever other source of healthcare, we are now half of our waiting room is full of people who are anxious or depressed, or they're having challenges in school with behaviorally. And so other healthcare practices were saying, we don't do this, but we made, a promise to never turn people away.
Right.
It's part of their code of conduct professionally. And so we did a lot of due diligence before we opened LÉVO, and we had a lot of great advisors, MDs, other physicians, others who were saying, if you're going to do it, this is how you should do it. Yeah. And so when we started LÉVO right up front, we knew that we needed to employ men and women who are educated and trained specifically in mental health medication assessment, diagnosis, and treatment. And so when people come to LÉVO, in fact, it's funny online, my online, persona, the trolls, who chase you a little bit, oh, well, you're a for-profit entity. You're making a bunch of money on people's mental health. And there's a message there, right? Which is, are you trying to use the mental health of people to make money? And we address that head on. In our business model, in our practice, we actually will try to get people off medication as much as we get them on or help that way. And so, in fact, our medical director recently came to me and said, hey, I had a woman recently who came in, and when we did all of the assessment and we diagnosed everything, she was low in certain hormones. So most people don't know, this is a big takeaway, that your hormone levels as men and women have a significant factor in your mental health.
Yep.
Well, as soon as we did the blood test and did all the bioassessment stuff that needs to occur, what was needed was her hormone levels needed to be adjusted.
Right.
Brought them up properly. Now she's off mental health medication. And so proper mental health medication management is getting off as much as getting on. It's adjusting levels properly to where people find optimal mental health.
Right.
And so the persona of, I'm going to be on medication the rest of my life, or I'm going to deal with all these side effects. Some may need it the rest of their lives. There are some mental health diagnoses where you should embrace medication.
Sure.
You should expect that you're going to need it long term. But there are many who need to bridge a certain episode of life or a time frame. A mother who's dealing with postpartum depression and just trying to get sleep. She's extremely fatigued, right? And so there's these episodic things that go on in life events where people just need to bridge the gap. And those are situations where LÉVO wants to help. Not forever, not going to be a client forever, but just let's bridge the gap together.
I think that's great. And I don't think there's any shame at all in saying we want to be the people that help with this. That's what, our economy is built on, is saying here's a need.
Right.
And to improve someone's life, and we're going to do that. And of course, that's going to cost money because we have to employ people to do that, right? I mean, that's just the way it happens. Yeah, what we're finding with mental health is that it's the causes are so diverse, multifaceted causes of mental health issues. I think years ago, maybe 15, 20, 30 years ago, we used to think it was a little more simplistic. Okay, well, this sort of thing causes this, kind of an A to B sort of thing. And what we're finding is it's A, B, C, D, E, and F all lead to X, right?
Absolutely.
Kind of all contribute. And medication and the biological part of it is absolutely a part for some people, and it needs to be addressed as well. I think the challenge that people were having, and as humans, we really like to reduce things to their most simplistic terms. And so we say, if I'm depressed, then I just need to take this medication and I won't be depressed anymore. A to B to C.
Right.
It's never that simple. And I can't tell you, I mean, I've dealt with tens of thousands of clients in my career. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard someone say, I started taking this medication, I felt pretty good for a while, and then it stopped working. Well, the medication probably didn't stop working, or maybe it did. I don't know what's going on, but I've heard that story so many times.
Yeah.
And I think it's because there's other factors. Like you said, the woman who's maybe postpartum and needs some help with that, she can get on some medication. She can also learn some different coping strategies and other things to do and attack this from, 5 different areas. And all of that's going to work together to improve her mental health.
Absolutely. You're cueing into something that I think is really important for listeners in general. And that is, when it comes to the mind, there is no one silver bullet. There is no one answer. And people want that, in our society. I think people want this one thing. Just take this one thing and it'll all be better, And by the way, if there's one thing, sleep.
If you're only going to do one thing, right?
Yeah,
get enough sleep.
Get good sleep, right? Like figure that out. Buy a Whoop and follow your sleep patterns, But there is no one thing, and it changes, by the way, right? It constantly changes. Yeah. And so people don't love that answer. They want a simplistic answer. But if people learn that mental health is a spectrum, I draw constantly on my whiteboard in my office. And if I could draw a picture for people, they would understand that they're really, it's a spectrum. It's a line, that goes out in both directions forever.
Mm-hmm.
And on one end of the spectrum is get healthy. When we talk about mental health, some people think, a black couch and sitting with a therapist. It may be.
Right.
Others may think of a yoga class, and it may be. Right. And it may be performance, a Tony Robbins, right? And so on one hand, you have people who are just trying to survive the day. I view that as health. And then you have others who are saying, hey, I'm healthy right now mentally. I'm in a good place, but I need maintenance. I need to be consistently doing something daily. I view that as wellness, right? That's Brainstoke, right?
Yep.
We mentioned me being a podcast, host. Brainstoke is all about these 5 daily habits, which is get sleep. It's the 5 S's.
Right.
Get sleep, get some sweat, get out in the sun, sex, and then stoke, which is do the things you're passionate about. Those 5 S's are just reminders to do what? Get serotonin in your brain.
Right.
They're happy chemicals that our brain needs every day for maintenance. So you have health, you have wellness, and then you have performance. The problem is that you have people who are unhealthy mentally, and all they're doing is scrolling their feed of Tony Robbins. How do I go from not healthy mentally to be a billionaire?
Right.
Well, that's kind of a spectrum.
Right.
Like there's a few steps in between, like I can't get off the couch every day to driving a Lambo and carrying Gucci. And so the spectrum is really moving from I need to get healthy to I need to be well. I need to build habits around wellness. Then you can move on to, taking on the world and performing at a high level.
Right.
And so people need to think that way. Black and white thinking about mental health is toxic because it doesn't exist. And that expectation that you can just take a thing or even go to therapy and think that it's all going to be better is not true. You have to think about it as this shades of gray in one direction or the other. By the way, what's really interesting is that if you look at high peak performance athletes, those that have their minds, right? You think about very successful athletes, Michael Jordan, those who were just this killer instinct. Most people think about them as that they're always up at that level. But if you really start to study their lives and what they're doing, all of them take time off to make sure they're well and that they're healthy mentally. And most of them who are running at a peak level have guys like you, who they speak to constantly, psychologists, therapists, performance coaches, which by the way is man speak for therapy.
Right.
Performance coaching at a high level for athletes and business professionals, they're typically psychologists.
Right.
They're trained mental health professionals who just happen to be performance coaches. Right. So anyway, spectrum thinking, I think, is a healthy way to think through the mind and how we can go from one spectrum to another.
I think it's extremely healthy that dichotomous black and white thinking is, like you said, it's toxic in mental health. It's toxic in just about everything.
Yeah.
In relationships, in the way we eat, those sorts of things. There's always a multitude of options and causes and effects. And the more we can kind of flex our brains around that, I think the easier we can manage life. So many of the people that I've worked with in my career that have really struggled in their mental health have that really black and white thinking. And it's either this or that. And when this is bad and that is bad, then they're stuck. And they come back to me a year later and they're still stuck because they can't move between those two things.
Absolutely.
But there's so many options out there. I really appreciate you saying that. I want to ask, want to get one thing in here before we close, because I love this about what you do. You talked about the difference between coping and thriving. Can you just explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, we jumped from my career and profession in the institutional financial services world to being in the mental health space. And in between all of that is my own mental health story. Mm-hmm. And so, even though I'm an investor and I invested in starting LÉVO and growing it, the reason that I'm willing, frankly, I'll just say this to be transparent, I've been working for 2.5 years free. I don't get paid at LÉVO. I don't take a salary, although I'm the major shareholder, but I do it because I've been there. I know what it's like to be in a really tough spot, to be depressed. I know what it's like to be an entrepreneur and to be working for free, growing a company, and having my aspirations as an entrepreneur destroy my mental health. I've done it. I did it on the way of growing and selling a company twice. I destroyed my mental health. And so in order to re-round and to keep in that world of entrepreneurship and growing, which I wanted to do, I had a passion for it. What did I have to do? I had to learn to manage me. Most people think entrepreneurship and growing and selling companies is about the best idea and execution of it and what's the market timing and all the stuff, right? All the strategy. But in reality, as an entrepreneur, you're the biggest variable. Can you stand in the fire? And I struggled with that. In my own journey in entrepreneurship, I had to learn to figure out how am I going to cope with all the stresses of starting and running a company. And to be frank, I was horrible. Early on in my 20s and 30s, I just wasn't good at managing stress. There was something in my DNA, in my growing up, in all of, just who I am. I wasn't good at managing stress, and the way that I dealt with stress was all of the things that you would imagine as someone growing up in Utah would do to manage stress. Overeat sugar big time, eat my feelings and emotions, just work longer hours, right? All the things. And what I started to recognize was I was the problem. And no one ever wants to say I'm the problem in my company, right? I just got off the phone on my way here with the CEO of LÉVO, and we talked about that. How is our blind spots of who we are going to limit our capability? Well, one of the biggest blind spots for entrepreneurs is their ability to cope positively, right? They don't know how to do it unless they've learned or they have a mentor who's helping them. So coping and thriving came from that era of my life. How do I cope with stress and how do I thrive? When most people have a moment in their mental health journey where they are absolutely eating humble pie, they're in that moment of, I'm struggling, I don't know what to do. And what I learned in my own mental health is that when you're in those moments, you only will have the capability to revert back to whatever tools you have, right? You're a trained psychologist. I wish I had all the tools that you have, right? But in those moments, all you're going to do is revert back to whatever tools you have. So if you grew up in a household where conversations were hard to have if there was anger, or you weren't, willing to address emotions outwardly or deal with that, and the way that you grew up, you just dealt with stress by eating your emotions, that's what you're going to do. That's the only tools that you have available, right? That's the only knowledge that you can lean back on and say, this is how I deal with stress. So what I started to recognize in those years was that I needed to deal and cope with stress better. And so what I mean by coping and thriving is that coping is just trying to survive the day. You're just trying to get through the day.
Head above water sort of thing.
Yeah. And if you don't have tools and knowledge and capability, then you're just going to survive the moment. Whereas for someone who's been there and they've tried to figure it out, they move to a strategy that allows them to thrive through stress. I wouldn't say today, because I've sold a couple companies, that I'm now just, capable of dealing with everything that comes to me. I have all the same stresses. In fact, today, I feel like I'm more stressed than I was for the last 20 years, and I have money in my bank account, right? So money doesn't solve stress.
No, it doesn't.
So people who think, I'm going to build a company and sell it and I'll now be stress-free, bull, right? That's BS.
Living proof here.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm better today because I have now tools, to deal with those stressors. So what do I put into my life that allows me to thrive despite stress? I make sure that I'm in the sun on a regular basis. If, I'm a ski bum too. So in the wintertime, it sounds so silly, but vitamin D works.
Yeah.
And if you're not getting out in the sun in the winter, you better supplement. I'm just telling you, it makes a difference. And so thriving is the ability to have a proactive and intentional plan to deal with stress. You will never get rid of it. We're all going to have it.
Right.
It's just part of life. But how we can react to it is on the spectrum of surviving versus thriving. It's having an intentional strategic plan that works for you. By the way, what I need to deal and thrive with stress is entirely personalized.
Exactly.
So when other people think, well, I'm going to read this book or whatever worked for Joe Mama, that may not necessarily mean anything to me.
I don't need to take up skiing in the winter to thrive.
Yeah, no, you got to figure out your own thing. And so when I hear people talk about their way of dealing with stress is that they want to sit in a quiet room and meditate, and that works for them, that's amazing.
Fantastic. Yeah.
What my brain needs, ADHD brain, or, just a brain that's racing all the time, I need to actually move.
Yeah.
Which is odd. You would think, well, don't you want to just like calm down a little bit? But I do my best thinking and my best coping, riding my bike and sweating. My body and movement allows my brain to slow down, which sounds strange. But if you have, young children who struggle, and they're constantly on the move, understand something that is their way of coping. When the mind races, to sit still, school was so hard for me. Church, Can you imagine, right? Sit quietly in a pew. So I just learned that my tailored way of dealing with stress is that I need movement constantly. To sweat and to be outside in the sun is a godsend. It changes who I am and my ability to deal and cope with life stress.
Tom, I appreciate you coming in today and,
of course.
Sharing your story and just this good counsel as well. I think one of the takeaways I get from this is just how individualized it is, but that we each need to be doing something. We each need to figure out what is it for us that works, that's going to help us move along that spectrum you're talking about, move from maybe the place we are to a little bit further, more developed, more engaged, more, I don't know what the right, resolved. That's the journey we're all taking. So
yeah,
thank you for sharing yours.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I share just one last thing?
Of course,
briefly?
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be perfect.
Yes.
Just so that people know when they heard me say exercise out in the sun, that's like, sounds great. But if you hate exercise, right? Think of the spectrum of coping. And, choose fries, some great fries that you love. That's better than 7 beers.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So it doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to be slightly healthier.
Yeah.
There are going to be days where you have the energy to exercise and do it. There are going to be days where it's fries, but you're sliding down the scale one way or another, slightly better habits over time. So don't shoot for perfection. It's this.
I love it. Great counsel.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Of course.
Appreciate it.
Thanks everyone for listening. Come back and listen again to future podcasts with other guests. We'd love to have you. Remember that change starts with you, and together we all work to improve our mental health momentum.